There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday night or a half-empty cup of tea cooling on the nightstand. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through the cracks of a routine, quiet as a change in the wind, and only in retrospect do you understand that they were not moments at all, but hinges. They were the precise, oiled mechanisms upon which the entire weight of your future was turning, shifting from one axis to another, and that the world you woke up to the next morning was fundamentally, irrevocably different from the one you had fallen asleep in. For me, that hinge was a sound in the dark, a name. My name, torn from the throat of the man sleeping beside me, not in passion, but in terror. He woke up with a gasp that was more of a choke, a ragged, desperate noise that ripped through the profound stillness of my bedroom at 3 in the morning. His body, which had been a warm, solid line of comfort against my back, suddenly coiled into a knot of tension, muscles locking as if against a physical blow. The movement was so violent it jolted the mattress, and I was awake instantly, my own heart kicking into a frantic, panicked rhythm, my mind still thick with the residue of a dream I could no longer remember. The air in the room was cold, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from him, a furnace of fear. I could feel the tremors running through his entire frame, a seismic event contained within the landscape of his body. Leo, it was not a call, not a question. It was a plea. The word was broken, fractured by the nightmare that still held him in its grip. It was the sound of a man clinging to the edge of a cliff, his fingers slipping, his one last hope whispered into the abyss. In the deep, velvety darkness of the room, punctuated only by the thin silver line of moonlight seeping under the blinds, his voice was a raw, exposed nerve. He had called my name. Not in the easy, casual way he did a dozen times a day, tossed over his shoulder as he grabbed a beer from my fridge, or called out from the living room to ask where I'd put the remote. This was different. This was elemental. He had reached out from the drowning depths of his own subconscious, and his hand had found my name as the only piece of solid ground in a world that was coming apart. I rolled over to face him, my own breathing shallow. His eyes were wide, slick with a film of sweat and panic, but they weren't seeing the room. They were seeing whatever horrors the dark architecture of his mind had constructed for him. His chest rose and fell in short, stuttering bursts. I reached out, my hand hovering in the charged space between us, a territory we had navigated with such careful, unspoken rules for months. The air was thick with everything we never said, a dense fog of yearning and restraint. Touching him now felt like a transgression, a violation of a treaty I had never even been sure existed. But the sound he made next, a low, wounded whimper, shattered all my hesitation. It was the sound of absolute loneliness. My fingers found his shoulder, and the contact was like a spark jumping a gap. He flinched, but not away from me. He flinched toward me, his body instinctively seeking the source of the touch. His wide, terrified eyes finally focused, locking onto mine. The recognition that dawned there was slow, like the first light of a winter morning, faint and fragile. He saw me. He really saw me. And the sheer, unadulterated relief that washed over his features was so profound it almost broke my heart. It was the look of a lost child finding his way home. Leo, he breathed again, and this time it was a sigh. The tension began to seep out of him, but the tremors remained, a lingering aftershock. His hand, which had been fisted in the sheets, uncurled and shot out, grabbing my wrist. His grip was not strong, but it was desperate. It was the grip of a man assuring himself that what he was touching was real. Solid. I'm here, I whispered, my voice rough with sleep and a tidal wave of emotions I couldn't begin to name. I'm here, Ethan. You're okay. It was just a dream. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. Don't, he started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, his throat working. The moonlight caught the sheen of sweat on his forehead. Don't leave, the words hung in the air between us, heavy and monumental. It wasn't a request. It was a command born of pure, undiluted need. Don't leave. As if I could. As if there were any force on earth that could have pulled me from that bed, from his side, in that moment. The thought was absurd. Leaving was a physical and metaphysical impossibility. The universe had contracted to the space of this mattress, to the distance between his hand and my wrist, to the shared air we were breathing. I won't, I said, and the words were a vow. An anchor dropped into the turbulent waters of the night. I'm not going anywhere. He didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, his fingers tightened, and he shifted closer, the heat of his body a near-scalding presence. He buried his face in the hollow of my shoulder, his breath hot and ragged against my skin. And he begged me. He wasn't just asking. He was begging. Please, he whispered into my collarbone, the word muffled and thick with a vulnerability I had never witnessed in him before. Please don't leave the bed. Just stay until morning. Please. And as I lay there in the dark, with the full weight of him collapsing against me, his fears slowly giving way to a desperate need for comfort, I understood that the hinge had turned. The ordinary Tuesday night had revealed its true face. The carefully constructed walls of our friendship, the meticulously observed boundaries I had spent years reinforcing from my side, had just been leveled by a nightmare. He didn't know it. He couldn't know it. But in his terror, he had just kicked down the door to the one room in my heart I had always kept locked, and now we were both inside, and I had no idea how we would ever find our way out, or if I even wanted to. To understand the sheer magnitude of that moment, the seismic shift that occurred in the tectonic plates of my life at 3 in the morning, you have to understand the foundation upon which our friendship was built. It was a structure of immense strength and baffling complexity, a cathedral of platonic love built on the bedrock of my silent, unrequited affection. Ethan and I had met in college, two celestial bodies on wildly different orbits that had somehow been drawn into the same gravitational pull. He was a supernova. I was a distant, quiet moon. He was the star forward on the university soccer team, a whirlwind of easy charm, booming laughter, and a casual confidence that seemed to be his birthright. His life was a highlight reel of game-winning goals, crowded parties, and a seemingly endless succession of beautiful, smiling girlfriends. I, on the other hand, was studying photography. I lived my life through a lens, more comfortable observing the world than participating in it. My natural state was on the periphery, in the quiet corners, documenting moments rather than creating them. I found solace in the controlled alchemy of the darkroom, in the magic of watching an image emerge from nothing on a sheet of paper submerged in chemicals. It was a process of patience, observation, and a deep, internal understanding of light and shadow. It was, in essence, the very architecture of my personality. I was quiet, I was patient, and I was adept at living in the half-light, noticing the details others missed. We were thrown together as reluctant roommates in our sophomore year, a classic case of the university housing algorithm's cruel sense of humor. The jock and the artist. It had all the makings of a terrible sitcom pilot. I remember the day he moved in, his presence filling the cramped dorm room until it felt like the walls themselves were struggling to contain his energy. He dropped 3 duffel bags full of sports equipment on the floor, flashed a grin that could have powered a small city, and stuck out a hand. "Ethan," he'd said, "hope you don't mind the smell of sweat and desperation." I think I managed to mumble my name, Leo, and retreated to my side of the room, which I had already organized with the geometric precision of a monk. I was prepared to hate him. I was prepared for loud music at all hours, for a constant parade of strangers, for a fundamental clash of lifestyles that would make my life a living hell. And for the first few weeks, it seemed my predictions were accurate. His alarm went off at a profane hour for morning practice, a blaring siren that felt like a personal assault. His side of the room looked like a sporting goods store had exploded. He was a force of nature, a benign hurricane, and I was just trying to keep my carefully arranged photographs from being swept away in the storm. But the thing about Ethan, the infuriating, disarming, utterly irresistible thing about him, was his light. It wasn't just the surface-level charisma. It was a genuine, radiant warmth that he seemed to give off without any effort at all. He was kind. It was a simple, uncomplicated fact that defied all my preconceived notions. He noticed when I was struggling with a heavy load of developing equipment and would simply take half of it from my hands without a word. He would come back from dinner and deposit a container of food on my desk if I'd been holed up working on a project, just saying, "Figured you forgot to eat." Again, he learned my schedule, my habits, my particular brand of quiet intensity, and instead of finding it weird or mocking it, he simply made space for it. He created a pocket of calm in his own hurricane where I could exist. And I, in turn, began to see past the supernova. I saw the pressure he was under to perform, both on the field and off it. I saw the flicker of exhaustion in his eyes after a brutal practice followed by a full night of studying for his engineering exams. I saw the quiet moments of loneliness that would settle over him when the crowd was gone and the cheering had stopped, when he was just a guy in a small room, 1,000 miles from his family. I started to document him, not just with my camera. Though my portfolio from that year is embarrassingly full of candid shots of him, sleeping at his desk, staring out the window, laughing with a teammate, but with my mind. I became the curator of his unspoken moods, the archivist of his vulnerabilities. The friendship that grew between us was deep and true, a source of constant surprise to everyone who knew us. We were an odd, complementary pair. He drew me out of my shell, dragging me to parties where I would stand in a corner, and he would orbit back to me every 20 minutes to make sure I was okay. I, in turn, provided him with a sanctuary, a place where he didn't have to perform. Our room became a haven where the jock could confess his fears about failing a calculus exam, and the artist could actually talk to another human being. We were the anchors for each other's ships, holding steady in the turbulent waters of university life. It was somewhere in the middle of our junior year that I realized the nature of my feelings for him had undergone a chemical change, like a photograph left too long in the developer, the lines darkening, the image becoming something new and sharp and undeniable. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was watching him sleep, the fierce concentration of his waking hours smoothed away, leaving his face open and boyish. It was the casual, unthinking way he would drape an arm over the back of my chair while he looked at my contact sheets, his warmth seeping into my shoulder. It was the sound of his laughter, a rich, full-bodied sound that resonated somewhere deep in my chest. I was in love with him. The realization didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a diagnosis. It was a fact I had to learn to live with, a chronic condition with no known cure. I was a photographer. I knew how to frame a shot. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was a picture I could never try to capture. Ethan was resolutely, unswervingly straight. His life was a testament to it. To confess my feelings would not be a romantic gamble. It would be an act of social and emotional sabotage. It would shatter the delicate, beautiful ecosystem of our friendship. It would make him uncomfortable. It would make me a cliché, and it would destroy the one thing, his friendship, that had become the central pillar of my life. So I did what I did best. I observed. I documented. I filed it away. I built a room inside myself, soundproofed and secure, and I locked my feelings for him inside. I became an expert in emotional self-protection. I learned to interpret his casual touches, a hand on my back, a playful shove, a head resting on my shoulder during a movie, as the currency of our specific friendship, and nothing more. I treated them like artifacts in a museum, to be admired for their form but never touched, never claimed. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade yearning, a quiet ache that became as familiar as my own heartbeat. It was the price of admission to his world, and I paid it without complaint. After college, we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment together. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He had a job as a software consultant that required a lot of travel, and I was trying to make it as a freelance photographer. The arrangement was perfect. I was a stable home base for his nomadic life, and he provided a steadying presence and a much-needed contribution to the rent in my uncertain one. Our friendship deepened, settling into the comfortable rhythms of adulthood. We weren't just roommates anymore. We were family. The odd couple had become an old married couple, as our mutual friends liked to joke. A joke that always landed with a dull thud in the pit of my stomach. The room inside me where I kept my feelings for him grew larger, more furnished. It was no longer a barren cell. It was a wing of the house, full of memories, of shared laughter, of quiet evenings spent in comfortable silence. I had learned to live with the ghost of what I wanted, to coexist with it peacefully. My love for him was a part of the landscape of my inner world, a silent mountain range on the horizon, always there, beautiful and immense, but unreachable. I had accepted that. I had made my peace with being the moon to his sun, content to reflect his light, to orbit at a safe, prescribed distance. I was the keeper of the quiet, the guardian of the status quo. And I believed, with a certainty born of years of practice, that it would always be this way. I believed I had everything under control. The catalyst, when it came, was named Sarah. She was a landscape architect Ethan met at a conference in Chicago, and she was, by all accounts, perfect for him. She was bright, ambitious, funny, and she had a laugh that could rival his own in its joyous volume. When he talked about her, his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since his game-winning goal in the college championships. They fell into a long-distance relationship that was intense and serious from the start. For 2 years, she was a constant, albeit distant, presence in our lives. A voice on the phone, a face on a screen, a recurring character in Ethan's stories about his weekends. I was, of course, happy for him. That's what a good friend is supposed to be, and a part of me truly was. Seeing him happy was a complex, bittersweet experience. It was like watching a beautiful sunset that you know signals the end of the day. Her existence solidified the boundaries of our friendship, reinforcing the walls I had so carefully constructed. She was the ultimate proof that the room inside me had to remain locked. I learned to ask about her, to listen to his plans for their future. Moving to the same city, marriage, a house, with a carefully practiced smile and a genuine warmth that cost me more than he could ever know. I became a master of compartmentalization. There was Leo, Ethan's best friend and roommate, who was rooting for his happiness. And then there was the man who lived inside the locked room, who heard those plans and felt a slow, quiet dimming of the light. The end of their relationship was as swift and unexpected as its beginning had been intense. There was no dramatic fight, no betrayal. It was a death by 1,000 practicalities. She got a major promotion in Chicago. His company was expanding its West Coast operations. Neither of them could, or was willing to, uproot their entire life. It was a slow, painful realization that their paths, which had run parallel for so long, were now diverging. The phone calls became less frequent, more strained. The future they had been building together began to look more like a blueprint for a house that would never be built. The breakup call happened on a Tuesday night. I remember this because I was in the living room, meticulously editing a set of photos from a wedding shoot, trying to find the perfect moment of joy on a bride's face. Ethan was in his room, on the phone. His door was closed, but the walls in our apartment were thin, porous to emotion. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the tone. The low, serious murmur of his voice, the long, heavy silences. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. After an hour, I heard the soft click of his phone being placed back in its cradle. And then, nothing. Just a silence that was louder and more profound than the conversation that had preceded it. He didn't come out of his room that night, or the next morning. When I left for a shoot, his door was still closed. When I came back in the afternoon, it was the same. I knocked gently, calling his name. There was a long pause, and then a muffled, "I'm fine," but he wasn't fine. The two words were a lie, and the sound of his voice was the sound of something broken. I left a plate of food outside his door, the same way he used to do for me in college. It was a silent, full-circle moment. A few hours later, I heard the door creak open, the plate being taken, and the door closing again. When he finally emerged, 2 days later, he looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The light, that brilliant, supernova radiance, was gone. In its place was a dull, gray exhaustion. His eyes were shadowed. His movements were slow and heavy, as if gravity had suddenly increased its pull on him alone. He drifted into the living room where I was working and just stood there for a moment, looking lost in the space that was as much his as it was mine. "It's over," he said, the words flat and lifeless. He didn't need to say with whom. I didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. I just looked at him and said, "I'm sorry." He nodded, and then he did something that marked the beginning of the shift. He walked over to the couch, but instead of sitting in his usual spot on the far end, he sank down onto the cushion right next to me. The proximity was startling. He just sat there, not speaking, and stared at the blank television screen. I went back to my editing, the clicks of my mouse the only sound in the room. After about 10 minutes, he slumped sideways, his head coming to rest on my shoulder. It wasn't a casual, playful gesture like the ones from our college days. This was a dead weight. It was the physical manifestation of surrender. He was too tired to hold his own head up, so he was letting me do it for him. I froze, my entire body going rigid. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every nerve ending was screamingly aware of the pressure of his head, the warmth of his hair against my neck, the soft sound of his breathing. The man in the locked room inside me was wide awake, rattling the door, begging to be let out. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. I forced my muscles to relax. This wasn't about me. This was about him. He was grieving. He was my friend. He needed an anchor, and I was the closest thing he had. I slowly, carefully, continued my work, my movements measured and deliberate, terrified that any sudden motion would startle him away. He stayed there for an hour, not sleeping, just resting. And when he finally straightened up, he didn't acknowledge what had just happened. He just mumbled something about getting some water and disappeared back into his room. But a line had been crossed. A new, unspoken permission had been granted. The architecture of our friendship had just sustained its first, tiny, structural crack. That first night on the couch became the blueprint for a new ritual. The days that followed the breakup were a blur of quiet grief for Ethan. He went through the motions of his life, logging into work remotely, talking to his family on the phone, but he was a ghost haunting his own body. The vibrant, kinetic energy that had always defined him had been replaced by a heavy, profound lethargy. He lost weight. The easy smile that was his default expression became a rare and fleeting thing. He was adrift on a vast, gray ocean of loss, and our apartment was the only lifeboat he had. And I, by extension, became his reluctant lighthouse. Every evening, he would emerge from the solitude of his room and gravitate toward the living room, toward me. He seemed to need my presence, my quiet, steady existence, as a counterbalance to the chaos inside him. He would sink onto the couch beside me, closer than he ever used to, and we would exist in a shared silence, punctuated by the sounds of my life. The click of my camera shutter as I tested a lens, the rustle of paper as I sketched out lighting designs, the low hum of the television playing some documentary I was only half watching. The ritual began with movies. It was his idea, a way to fill the deafening silence. "Let's watch something," he'd say, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "Anything. I don't care," so we watched movies. Epics, comedies, thrillers. It didn't matter. The content was irrelevant. The true purpose was the proximity. We'd start on opposite ends of the large sectional sofa, a respectable, friendly distance between us. But as the evening wore on and the exhaustion of his grief settled deeper into his bones, the space would inevitably collapse. It would start with his foot nudging mine. Then his leg would be resting alongside my own. And then, like a slow tide coming in, he would shift, inch by inch, until he was leaning against me, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder. The first few times it happened, my entire system went into overdrive. My body would become a battleground of conflicting impulses. One part of me, the logical, self-protective part, screamed warnings. "This is dangerous territory. Don't get used to this. This is not for you." It was the voice of the man who had spent a decade building walls. But another part of me, the deeper, more honest part, the man in the locked room, simply yielded. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been allowed to visit. The sheer, overwhelming rightness of it was terrifying. Having him there, his weight against me, his breathing syncing with my own, was a quiet, devastating bliss. So I learned to silence the warnings. I learned to just be present in the moment, to accept this strange, temporary gift for what it was, a friend needing comfort. I told myself that, over and over, until it almost felt true. The ritual evolved. One night, about a month into this new, fragile reality, he fell asleep on my shoulder. It was halfway through some mindless action movie, and his breathing just deepened and evened out. His body went lax, and his full weight settled against me. I didn't move. I sat there for 2 hours, my own muscles cramping, a dead arm, the movie ending and the credits rolling in silence, until the screen went black. I was a statue, a living piece of furniture. I was terrified that if I shifted, if I even breathed too deeply, I would wake him, and this fragile bubble of intimacy would pop. I studied his face in the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the window. The lines of stress around his eyes were softened in sleep. His mouth was slightly parted. He looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. A fierce, protective instinct washed over me, so powerful it was dizzying. It was a feeling that was dangerously close to the love I kept locked away. When he finally stirred, it was past midnight. He blinked, disoriented, and slowly straightened up, a groan escaping his lips. "Oh, man," he mumbled, rubbing his neck. "I'm sorry. I completely passed out. It's okay," I said, my voice a little stiff. "You were tired." He looked at me, his eyes still clouded with sleep. "You should have woken me up. You needed the rest," I said simply. He stared at me for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Gratitude? Confusion? I couldn't tell. Then he nodded, pushed himself up from the couch, and shuffled off to his room without another word. The space he left behind on the couch felt cavernous and suddenly cold. After that night, falling asleep on the couch became a regular occurrence. It was part of the ritual. He would fight it, his eyes drooping, his head nodding, and then he would finally surrender, slumping against me as if pulled by an irresistible gravity. I became an expert in stillness. I learned how to angle my body to give him better support. I learned to anticipate the moment he would fall asleep by the subtle change in his breathing. I learned to exist in this strange, suspended state of heightened awareness and profound peace. My work suffered. My sleep schedule was a wreck. But I wouldn't have traded those quiet, stolen hours for anything. They were a dangerous, addictive drug, and I was a willing addict. The next escalation felt both inevitable and shocking. It was a particularly bad week. A project at his work had gone sideways, and the pressure was immense. On top of that, it would have been his and Sarah's 3rd anniversary. He was a wreck, a raw, jangled nerve. He hadn't been sleeping, plagued by a relentless insomnia that left him hollow-eyed and brittle. That night, we weren't watching a movie. He was just sitting on the couch, staring into space, while I tried to read a book. The silence in the room was thick with his misery. Finally, around 1 in the morning, I closed my book. "Ethan," I said gently, "you need to sleep." He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. "I can't," he said, his voice hoarse. "Every time I close my eyes, my brain just starts. I can't turn it off. I just lie there, in the dark. The silence is so loud." He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "It's stupid. I feel like a kid. I hate being alone in there." The words hung in the air, a raw and honest confession. "I hate being alone in there." He was talking about his bedroom, but he could have been talking about his own head. And in that moment, an idea took root in my mind, a wild, reckless, insane idea. But before I could even formulate it, let alone dismiss it, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "This is going to sound crazy," he started, and he wouldn't look at me. He was staring at his hands. "And you can totally say no. God, please say no if it's weird. But do you think could I just sleep in here? On the couch? I don't know. Just knowing someone else is in the room. It feels less empty." My heart did a slow, painful lurch. The man in the locked room was screaming. He wanted to say, "No, don't sleep on the couch. My bed is bigger. It's more comfortable. Sleep there. Sleep with me." But that was the voice of madness, the voice of a decade of repressed hope. The voice of Leo, the good friend, the safe harbor, was the one that answered. "The couch is a brick," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You won't get any real rest. My bed is a king. There's more than enough room." The words were out before I had fully processed them. They hung in the air between us, shimmering with possibility and peril. I had just laid a minefield and invited him to walk through it. I held my breath, waiting for the explosion, waiting for him to laugh it off, to get weirded out, to retreat back into the safety of his own room. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face was one of profound, heartbreaking relief. It was the look of a drowning man who has just been thrown a life raft. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just pure, unadulterated need. "Really?" he asked, his voice small. "You wouldn't mind?" "I wouldn't have offered if I did," I lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. I didn't know anymore. The lines between what I wanted and what he needed had blurred into an indistinguishable gray. And so, the ritual shifted again, moving from the public space of the living room to the deeply private sanctuary of my bedroom. That first night was an exercise in agonizing self-control. I gave him a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants to sleep in. I watched him change, my back mostly turned as I pretended to be busy arranging my pillows. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every rustle of fabric. When he climbed into the bed, he stayed meticulously on his side, a good 2 feet of space between us, a vast, arctic expanse of white sheet. "Thanks, Leo," he whispered into the darkness. "Seriously, this helps. Get some sleep, Ethan." I whispered back. Sleep, of course, was an impossibility for me. I lay on my back, rigid as a board, listening to the sound of his breathing. I could feel the heat of his body across the distance, a warmth that called to me like a siren's song. I was in my own bed, a space that had always been my own private kingdom, and I felt like an intruder. I was acutely aware of the fact that the man I was in love with was sleeping 3 feet away from me, and that he was only there because he was broken, and I was a convenient, human-sized bandage. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid in my throat. But as the night wore on, something shifted. In his sleep, he moved. He was a restless sleeper, always had been. He mumbled things I couldn't understand. And he migrated. Slowly, unconsciously, he rolled toward the center of the bed, toward the warmth, toward me. I felt the mattress dip as he drew closer. An arm flopped over, his hand brushing my side. I flinched, my whole body tensing. He didn't pull back. He just sighed in his sleep, a soft, contented sound, and settled. A few minutes later, a knee bumped against my thigh. And then, the final, devastating blow. He rolled onto his side, facing me, and threw an arm over my waist, his face burying itself in the space between my shoulder and my neck. His body was flush against mine, from chest to knee. He was holding me. He was holding me in his sleep, with the unthinking, instinctual possessiveness of a man holding on to something that brought him comfort. His breathing, deep and even now, puffed warmly against my skin. The man in the locked room inside me didn't just rattle the door this time. He broke it down. He walked out into the ruins of my self-control and surveyed his new kingdom. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. I lay there, trapped by his sleeping form, my heart pounding a rhythm that felt like it could shake the whole bed, and I felt a joy so sharp and painful it was indistinguishable from grief. This was everything I had ever wanted, and it meant absolutely nothing. It was a phantom limb, a ghost of an embrace. He would wake up in the morning, pull away in a flash of awkward embarrassment, and the space between us would be a chasm again. But he didn't. When I woke up the next morning to the gray light of dawn, he was still there, wrapped around me as if I were a life-sized pillow. His face was peaceful, the deep lines of exhaustion erased. He looked content, safe. I watched him sleep for a long time, until the sun was fully up. When he finally started to stir, his eyes fluttering open, they focused on mine from a distance of only a few inches. There was a moment of sleep-dazed confusion, and I braced myself for the recoil, the apology, the hasty retreat. It never came. He just blinked, a slow, lazy blink. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick and deep with sleep. And he didn't move. He didn't pull his arm back. He didn't shift away. He just looked at me, his eyes clear and calm, and held me a little tighter. In that moment, the world tilted. The rules I thought we were playing by were not just broken, they were incinerated. He was awake. He was aware. And he wasn't leaving. This was the night that brought us to the hinge. Weeks had passed since that first morning he'd woken up in my arms and chosen not to pull away. The ritual was now firmly, terrifyingly established. Sharing my bed was no longer a desperate, one-time measure. It was the default. It was our new normal. He would finish his work, I would finish mine, and at some unspoken, mutually agreed-upon time, we would both retreat to my bedroom. The pretense was gone. He no longer mentioned his insomnia or his empty room. He didn't need to. We had an arrangement, a silent contract written in the language of proximity and touch. The nights were a landscape of breathtaking intimacy and agonizing restraint. He was an incredibly tactile sleeper, and his subconscious had no concept of personal space. Every night, he would find me. He would wrap himself around me, his long limbs tangled with mine, his head tucked into my neck, his hand resting over my heart. He was seeking comfort, warmth, a human anchor in the dark. I was his living security blanket. And I was drowning. I was drowning in the glorious, heartbreaking flood of it all. To lie there, night after night, holding the man I loved, breathing in the scent of his skin, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back. It was a pleasure so acute, it was a form of torture. It was everything, and it was nothing. During the day, we orbited each other in a state of strange, gentle domesticity. We'd wake up tangled together, and he would murmur a sleepy, "good morning," before rolling out of bed to make coffee, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We'd share breakfast in a comfortable silence, the morning light filling the kitchen. There was a new softness to him, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. The raw, jagged edges of his grief had been worn smooth by what? By sleep? By time? Or by this strange, indefinable thing we were doing? He was still sad, still healing, but the hollowed-out look was gone. He was starting to look like himself again, and the light was slowly returning to his eyes. My camera, my trusted observer, became my confessor. I started taking pictures of him again, but these were different. They weren't the stolen, candid shots of a distant admirer. They were intimate. They were portraits of a quiet becoming. Ethan sleeping in my bed, sunlight striping his bare back. Ethan at the kitchen table, a coffee mug cradled in his hands, a thoughtful expression on his face. Ethan on the couch, laughing at something on his laptop, the smile finally reaching his eyes again. Looking at the images on my contact sheets, I saw a story unfolding, a narrative I was too terrified to read. The pictures didn't lie. They showed a man who was not just being comforted, but a man who was finding a new kind of home. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, a beautiful, fragile bubble. I knew it couldn't last. I knew that at some point, the real world would intrude. He would finish grieving. He would feel whole again. He would meet someone new. And this beautiful, strange, nocturnal life we were living would end. He would move back into his own room. The Arctic expanse of sheet would return, and this time it would be permanent. The thought was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my temporary peace. I was clinging to the present moment, trying to soak up enough of this impossible warmth to last me a lifetime. And then came the night of the nightmare. It was different from the others. He had been more restless than usual all evening, a nervous energy humming just beneath his skin. He'd had a brief, stilted phone call with Sarah, something about logistics, shipping the last of her things from our apartment. The call had left him quiet and withdrawn. When we went to bed, he was tense. He lay on his side, his back to me, a rigid line of unspoken distress. I gave him his space, a silent offering of non-demand. I lay on my own side, the distance between us feeling more like a chasm than it had in weeks. I must have drifted off, because the sound that woke me was the one that tore through the fabric of the night, the sound that became the hinge. The ragged, choked gasp, the violent coiling of his body, and then my name, ripped from his throat in a sound of pure terror. Leo, when I rolled over and he grabbed my wrist, his eyes wild with the remnants of his dream. It was a repeat of a scene we had played out in a softer key so many times. But this time, the stakes were different. The fear was real, not just a manifestation of grief or loneliness. It was a primal terror. And when he begged me not to leave, when he buried his face in my shoulder, his body trembling like a leaf in a storm, it wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about rescue. "I'm here," I whispered, my hand coming up to cradle the back of his head, my fingers tangling in his hair. "I'm here, Ethan. I'm not going anywhere. Just breathe. Breathe with me." I held him, my body curved around his, trying to lend him my own calm, my own strength. I rocked him gently, murmuring meaningless, soothing sounds, the way you would with a frightened child. The tremors racking his body slowly, gradually, began to subside. His breathing, which had been short, panicked gasps, started to lengthen, to match the slow, steady rhythm of my own. The immediate crisis was passing. The adrenaline was seeping away, leaving behind a heavy, trembling exhaustion. He didn't pull away. He burrowed closer, as if trying to crawl inside my skin, to merge with the source of safety. He was clinging to me, his arms wrapped around my torso, his face still hidden in my neck. We lay like that for a long time, the only sound in the room the dual rhythm of our breathing, slowly finding its harmony. The darkness was no longer empty. It was filled with the charged, electric presence of our shared vulnerability. And then he shifted. He didn't pull back, but he lifted his head from my shoulder. In the faint moonlight, I could see his face, inches from mine. His eyes were no longer wild with fear. They were dark, deep pools of something else, something I couldn't decipher. They were full of a raw, unguarded emotion that I had never seen there before. The terror had passed, and in its wake, it had left him completely, utterly open. He looked at me, his gaze searching my face as if he were seeing it for the first time. His eyes traced the line of my brow, my nose, my mouth. It was the most intense scrutiny I had ever been under, more revealing than the lens of any camera. I felt stripped bare, my own carefully guarded heart exposed to his gaze. I didn't dare to breathe. The bubble we had been living in was stretched taut, shimmering, about to burst. His hand, which had been gripping my shirt, moved. Slowly, tentatively, his fingers traced the line of my jaw, his touch feather-light, a question in itself. My skin burned where he touched me. My heart, which had just started to slow, kicked back into a frantic, hopeful, terrified gallop. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He closed it, swallowed, and tried again. His voice, when it finally came, was a barely audible whisper, a fragile thread of sound in the immense quiet of the room. "Leo, I'm here," I breathed, my own voice a ghost. He shook his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "No," he whispered. "I know you're here. That's the only thing I do know." He paused, his thumb stroking my cheek, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. I think I'm about to do something stupid. Or maybe it's the smartest thing I've ever done. I don't know. My entire world had contracted to the space between our faces, to the feel of his thumb on my skin. The man in the locked room was no longer there. He was here, in my eyes, in my throat, in the thunder of my pulse. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his eyes never leaving mine. The question was huge, terrifying, and breathtakingly simple. He wasn't asking for permission to do something. He was asking if the world I inhabited had space for the world he was just now discovering in himself. He was asking if he was safe here, not just from his nightmares, but with his dawning truth. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" Time stopped. The universe held its breath. The hinge, which had been slowly turning for months, finally swung wide open. There was no going back. This was the moment. This was the precipice. And all the years of silent yearning, of patient observation, of carefully managed hope, coalesced into a single, simple truth. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Words were inadequate, clumsy tools for a moment of such profound, delicate honesty. Instead, I closed the small, remaining distance between us. My lips met his in a kiss that was not about passion, or lust, or conquest. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was a confession. It was an answer. It was the quiet, mutual recognition of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. It was soft and tentative, and it tasted of salt from the tears I hadn't even realized I was crying. It was the sound of a door, not being kicked down, but being quietly, reverently, unlocked from both sides. The aftermath of a storm is a strange and deceptive landscape. The sky can be a brilliant, cloudless blue, the air washed clean, but the ground is littered with the evidence of the chaos that has just passed. Our world, the small, two-person universe we had created, was like that in the days that followed the kiss. The kiss itself, and what came after, a night spent not in the desperate clinging of comfort, but in the slow, tender exploration of a new reality, a landscape of gentle touches and whispered questions, and the breathtaking discovery of mutual affection. Felt like a miracle. When we woke up the next morning, tangled in each other in the morning light, it felt like the beginning of everything. But miracles are fragile, and the dawn has a way of casting long, complicated shadows. The shift in Ethan was subtle at first, a slight cooling in the atmosphere that I tried to convince myself I was imagining. The easy, comfortable domesticity of the morning after felt different. He was quiet, but it was not the peaceful, contented quiet of the days before. It was a tense, thoughtful silence. He made the coffee, just like always, but he stood by the counter to drink it, his back to me. The physical space he put between us felt like a chasm. The man who, just hours before, couldn't bear to be an inch away from me, was now creating a careful, deliberate distance. I tried to ignore it. I told myself he was processing. He was a man who had only ever dated women, a man whose entire conception of his own life had been built on a certain, straight trajectory. The events of the previous night had not just been a turn in the road. They had been a complete and total demolition of the map he had been following. He needed time. He needed space. And I, who had made a life's work out of being patient, could give him that. I would be the calm, steady anchor yet again. But the distance didn't shrink. It grew. That night, when it came time for bed, a new, excruciating awkwardness descended upon us. We stood in the hallway, a few feet from my bedroom door, and for the first time in months, the path forward was not clear. I'm, I'm pretty beat, he said, not meeting my eyes. He gestured vaguely toward his own room, a room that had become a glorified storage closet for his unused things. Think I'll just crash in my own bed tonight. Get a full night's sleep, you know? The words were a physical blow. They were a casual, brutal undoing of everything. Crash in my own bed. He said it as if the past few months hadn't happened. As if my bed hadn't become our bed. He was retreating. He was running back to the safety of the old map, pretending the new world we had discovered didn't exist. Oh, I said, and my voice sounded small and thin to my own ears. Okay, yeah, of course, what else could I say? I couldn't force him to stay. I couldn't point out the hypocrisy, the sheer emotional whiplash of it all. So I just stood there, my feet rooted to the floor, and watched him walk away from me, down the hall to his own room. He closed the door behind him, and the soft click of the latch was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a wall being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. I slept in my bed alone for the first time in months. The king-sized mattress felt like a barren, icy tundra. The space beside me wasn't just empty. It was a screaming void, a phantom limb that ached with his absence. I didn't sleep. I lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the kiss, his whispered question, the look in his eyes. Had I imagined it all? Had I misinterpreted a moment of profound vulnerability and emotional confusion as something more? Was I just a convenient port in a storm, a temporary fix for a broken heart, a warm body to ward off nightmares? The next few days were a special kind of hell. We were roommates again, but worse. We were strangers, haunted by the ghost of an intimacy we were both pretending had never happened. We moved around each other with a careful, painful choreography of avoidance. He left for the office early, citing a need to be in person for his project. He came home late. We communicated through brief, polite text messages. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a minefield. Every surface, every corner, was imbued with a memory I was trying to suppress. The couch where he first leaned on me. The spot in the kitchen where he'd laugh. The bed. My God, the bed. The man in the now-shattered locked room was raging. He was hurt. He was angry. He felt like a fool. A part of me wanted to storm into Ethan's room and demand an explanation. I wanted to shake him and ask him how he could do this, how he could open a door in my soul and then just walk away and pretend it was never there. But the other part of me, the quiet observer, the patient friend, was just heartbroken. I was mourning not just the loss of what I thought we were building, but the potential loss of the friendship that had been the bedrock of my entire adult life. In my terror of losing him entirely, I said nothing. I let the silence fester. I let the distance grow. The breaking point came after a week of this silent, cold war. I came home from a long, grueling shoot, bone-tired and emotionally frayed. I walked into the apartment, and he was there, in the kitchen, on the phone. His back was to me, but I heard him say the name. Sarah. He was laughing. A real, genuine laugh. The sound of it was like a shard of glass in my chest. He was talking to her, laughing with her, and he couldn't even look at me. He finished the call, turned around, and saw me standing there. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a guarded, uncomfortable expression. Hey, he said. Didn't hear you come in. And something inside me just snapped. The patience, the understanding, the carefully constructed self-control, it all just crumbled into dust. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. My voice, when it came out, was dangerously quiet, devoid of all emotion. We need to talk, he flinched. Leo, I'm really tired. I don't care, I said, cutting him off. The coldness in my own voice surprised me. We're not doing this anymore. This silence. This pretending. We're going to talk. Now. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, my couch, and waited. He followed me after a moment, his movements reluctant. He didn't sit. He stood by the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. He looked like a cornered animal. What do you want to talk about, Leo? He asked, his tone wary. I want to talk about why you're sleeping in your own room, I said, the words blunt and artless. I want to talk about why you can't look me in the eye. I want to talk about the fact that you kissed me, you held me all night, you let me believe that something had finally, actually changed, and then you just vanished. I want you to look at me and tell me what the hell is going on in your head, Ethan. Because I am losing my mind." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at a spot on the floor, his jaw tight. I could see the struggle in him, the war being waged behind his eyes. "It was a mistake," he finally mumbled, the words directed at the floorboards. "A mistake," I repeated, and a raw, incredulous laugh escaped me. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "A mistake? What part was the mistake, Ethan? The part where you were having nightmares, and the only thing that calmed you down was me? The part where you spent months sleeping in my bed, wrapped around me like a life raft? The part where you looked at me like I was the only person in the world and asked if you could kiss me? Which one of those was the mistake? Or was the mistake just me? Was I the mistake?" "No," he said, and he finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, frantic pain. "No, you were never the mistake. It's me. I'm the mistake. I'm so messed up." "Leo," he finally moved, sinking down onto the armchair opposite me, his head in his hands. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, his voice muffled. "That night, it was the most real thing I've felt in maybe ever. When I'm with you, everything is quiet. My head stops screaming. I feel safe. I feel home." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "But then the morning comes, and I look in the mirror, and I don't know who that person is anymore. The guy who kisses his best friend, who is a man, that's not me. It can't be me. My whole life, I've been this other guy. The soccer player. Sarah's boyfriend. This person," he gestured around, at the apartment, at himself, as if it were all a costume he was wearing. "I freaked out," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I kissed you, and it felt right, and that scared the hell out of me. Because if that was right, then my entire life up until that point has been what? A lie? Wrong? I don't know. So I ran. I ran back to what was familiar. My room. My life. I even called Sarah, trying to see if that felt normal again. It didn't. It just felt empty." He finally looked at me, his face a mask of confusion and despair. "I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I don't know who I am. And I'm terrified of dragging you down with me while I figure it out." And just like that, the anger drained out of me, replaced by a vast, aching tenderness. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a version of himself he didn't understand yet. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the implications of what I meant to him. He was lost, not adrift on an ocean of grief anymore, but lost in a new, uncharted wilderness within himself. And he was alone. I stood up, crossed the small space between us, and knelt on the floor in front of his chair. I gently took his hands, pulling them away from his face. His fingers were cold. I held them in mine. "Hey," I said softly. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Ethan, look at me." He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were slick with unshed tears. "You don't have to have it all figured out," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to label it. You don't have to know who you're going to be tomorrow or next year. All you have to know is what feels right now. You said that when you're with me, your head is quiet. You said you feel home." I squeezed his hands. "So stop running from the one place you feel safe. You don't have to figure this out alone. We can be confused together. We can be terrified together. Just don't be in your room, and I in mine. That's the only thing that feels wrong." A single tear escaped his eye and tracked its way down his cheek. He looked at me, at our joined hands, at the sincerity in my face. And for the first time in a week, I saw a flicker of the man from that night. The man who was open and vulnerable and honest. "Is that okay?" he whispered, echoing his own question from that fateful night. "Is it okay if I don't know anything, except that I just want to be near you?" "It's more than okay," I said, and my own voice was thick with emotion. "It's a start. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something broken, like a week of painful silence or a tearful, late-night confession. They don't feel like beginnings. They feel like endings. But sometimes, things have to be broken down to their essential components before they can be rebuilt into something stronger, something more honest." That night, sitting on the floor of our living room, holding hands in the ruins of our misunderstanding, was not an ending. It was the laying of a new foundation. We didn't solve everything with that one conversation. There was no magical epiphany that erased all of Ethan's fear and confusion. Identity is not a switch that can be flipped. It's a landscape that is slowly, painstakingly terraformed over time. But the conversation changed the weather. The Cold War ended, and a fragile, tentative spring began. He didn't run anymore. He stayed. That night, he slept in my bed again. But it was different. There was no desperate, unconscious clinging. Instead, we lay on our sides, facing each other, a few inches of space between us. It was a conscious, deliberate choice. Before we turned out the light, he reached across the space and took my hand. He didn't say anything. He just held it, his thumb stroking the back of my palm. It was an anchor, a promise, not of a certain future, but of a shared present. A promise to not get lost in the dark alone. The days that followed were a study in quiet intention. The easy, unthinking domesticity we'd had was gone, replaced by something more mindful, more precious. Every touch, every shared glance, was a choice. We were learning a new language together, a language of quiet reassurance and patient affection. We talked. We had never really talked before, not about the space between us. We had communicated in gestures, in proximity, in shared silence. Now, we used words. He told me about the pressure he'd felt his whole life to fit a certain mold. I told him about the years of silent observation, about the room inside my heart. I showed him the photographs, the secret history of my love for him, and he looked at them not with shock or discomfort, but with a kind of sad, gentle wonder, as if seeing a part of his own story he had never known was being written. We were building our own map, one small step at a time. The physical architecture of our apartment began to reflect the new architecture of our relationship. The door to his room stayed open now, not as a symbol of retreat, but as a sign that there were no more barriers between us. The two distinct territories of my room and his room began to merge into our space. His clothes started to mingle with mine in the closet. His books appeared on my nightstand. There were still moments of fear, flashes of the old panic in his eyes. There were days when he was quiet and distant, retreating into his own head to wrestle with the ghosts of his old life. But he didn't run. He would just find my hand, or lean his head on my shoulder for a moment, a silent request for patience, for anchorage. And I would give it, freely and without question. I was learning that love isn't just about the grand, cinematic moments. It's about the quiet, steadfast commitment to holding space for someone else's fear, for their confusion, for their becoming. It's about being the lighthouse, not just in the storm, but in the fog, trusting that they will find their own way to the shore. And slowly, surely, the fog began to lift. The tentative touches became confident. The whispered questions became easy conversations. The quiet ache of my yearning was replaced by the profound, steady peace of a love that was not just acknowledged, but returned. The joy was no longer sharp and painful. It was a deep, resonant hum, the foundation upon which we were building our new life. One Saturday morning, months later, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I found him in the kitchen, bathed in the golden morning light, a soft smile on his face. He was no longer a supernova, nor was he a ghost. He was just Ethan, my Ethan. He handed me a mug, and his fingers brushed mine. The casual touch was no longer fraught with unspoken meaning. It was simply the easy, comfortable language of us. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, simple morning kiss that was as natural as breathing. It wasn't a confession or a question. It was a statement. It was home. We had healed. We had healed from the breakup that had been the catalyst, from the years of unspoken feelings, from the fear and the confusion. We had found our way out of the dark, not by ignoring it, but by walking through it together, holding hands. The hinge had turned, the door had been unlocked, and we had stepped through it into a world that was brighter and quieter and infinitely more honest. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.